Okay, let's dive into this fascinating explainer on David Noonan's action research study, Learner Strategy Training in the Classroom. Have you ever noticed how some students completely excel when they're given really specific instructions, but then they just totally freeze up when you ask them to direct their own learning? Well, today we are going to explore exactly how to shift students from that passive mindset into a highly active, self-monitoring approach. We're looking at real classroom data, real student transformations, and some truly actionable strategies that, honestly, redefine what it means to actually learn. To really get the most out of this case study, we are going to follow the exact structure of Noonan's original text. So we'll hit 1, Introduction, 2, the project, 3, Procedure, 4, Categories of tasks, 5, Results and discussion, and 6, Conclusion.
All right, let's start with Section 1, Introduction.
Noonan sets the stage here by looking at this incredibly stark contrast between the heavy guidance you get in high school and the sudden, kind of terrifying autonomy required in university. I mean, a lot of students enter college fully expecting the teacher to structure everything for them, to tell them exactly what to learn and exactly how to learn it. Listen to this quote from Sandy, a real first-year student at the University of Hong Kong. She perfectly captures the pain point of what she calls the traditional spoon-feeding education system. She says, "We are fed with piles of notes, making everyone entirely examination-oriented." But then she hits the nail on the head. In universities, things are totally different. Suddenly, lecturers leave this huge area for students to explore totally on their own. And it was students exactly like Sandy who actually prompted Noonan to take action. He wanted to figure out, could he help them develop the self-reflective skills they needed to actually survive and thrive as university students? The overarching goal wasn't just, teaching them English. It was to incorporate learning strategy and self-monitoring dimensions right into the classroom. Basically, he wanted to teach them how to learn. Which brings us to Section 2, the project. So this was a small-scale action research project focused on 60 first-year undergraduate liberal arts students at the University of Hong Kong. These students were right in the middle of making that massive jump from high school to university, which made them the perfect candidates. Noonan set out to answer 4 core questions. He wanted to know, would learner strategy training lead to greater sensitivity to the language learning process? What effect would guided reflection actually have on their learning skills? Would all this reflection lead them to set more realistic goals? And, maybe most importantly, would this training encourage students to actually use their language skills out in the real world beyond the classroom? Okay, Section 3, Procedure. Now, you might be wondering, how do you actually implement something like this in a real classroom without completely overwhelming everyone? Well, Noonan designed a very specific timeline. Right at the beginning of the semester, students were introduced to the project's aims. By the end of week 1, they were already filling out their first guided journals. And then, over a 12-week period, they went through a program based on a very specific bank of tasks. To track what was going on in their heads, Noonan used these guided journals. But it wasn't just a free writing exercise. Students were given exact sentence starters. Things like, "This week I studied," "This week I learned," or "This week I made these mistakes." It was a highly structured way to basically force the students to deeply analyze their own educational habits every single week. Let's move into Section 4, Categories of Tasks. This 12-week program was built around 4 distinct categories of tasks. Category 1 was all about stimulating a focus on the general learning process, basically asking students what actually works best for them. And this is so cool. When students were asked about their major concerns, the biggest worry, by far, was the embarrassment of speaking in front of the whole class. But instead of the teacher fixing it, the students proposed their own solution. They suggested rehearsing tasks in pairs or small groups before having to speak publicly. Noonan said yes, and just like that, the students were empowered from day 1. Category 2 focused on the context and environment of learning. Noonan had the students evaluate different modes of learning by rating small group tasks from A to H. You had your traditional stuff, like Task C, which was correcting grammatical errors in a passage. But then you had highly interactive stuff, like Task H, which was literally role-playing a job interview panel. Students had to rank them from most to least popular. And the transformation here is absolutely wild. At the beginning of the semester, these students heavily preferred the traditional school tasks, correcting grammar, filling in blanks. I mean, it makes sense, right? That's what they were used to. But by the end of the semester, after exploring new ways to learn, their preferences completely flipped. They shifted entirely to those highly communicative experiential tasks, the role-playing, the collaborative problem-solving. Their whole definition of a good classroom task had completely evolved. Next up, Category 3 tackled the macro skills: reading, writing, listening, and speaking. A major strategy they focused on here was selective listening. Now, at first, students rated this strategy really low. But once they actually tried it out, they had this massive realization. You literally do not need to understand every single word someone says to successfully listen to them. For university students sitting in dense lectures, this is a total game changer. It quickly became one of their favorite strategies. Finally, Category 4 focused on grammar and vocabulary through a concept called inductive learning. Think of it like a giant puzzle. Instead of the teacher handing you the grammar rule on a silver platter, you study examples of language in use, and you have to find the underlying patterns yourself. This was completely foreign to students used to high school spoon-feeding, but by putting them in the position of information gatherers, they ended up developing a ton of newfound self-competence.
All right, Section 5, Results and Discussion.
So, what actually happens when you put 60 students through 12 weeks of strategy training and nonstop journaling? Let's look at how their journal entries evolved. The results were striking. Over the semester, there was a very clear shift away from a rigid linguistic focus, viewing language as just this static object to be studied and memorized. Instead, they moved towards a communicative focus, seeing language for what it really is, a dynamic tool to be used in the real world.
And really, the crux of this whole study is this massive shift from a product orientation to a process orientation. When students wrote in their journals about mistakes they made, they actually stopped obsessing over tiny grammar errors or their final grade. Instead, they started analyzing the process. They were focusing on how they learned, looking into deeper issues like the actual causes of a cross-cultural communicative breakdown. They were thinking like true learners. But here is probably the most fascinating takeaway. Simply posing those weekly journal questions acted as a massive consciousness-raising tool. Just by having an answer, "This week I used my English in these places," the students actively started seeking out opportunities outside the classroom. They literally started talking to strangers just so they'd have something to write down. They developed an incredibly precise understanding of their own difficulties, and they even started connecting their English study to their other academic subjects. The act of reflection itself was the catalyst for change.
And that brings us to Section 6, Conclusion.
To wrap this all up, Noonan's action research proved definitively that when you combine strategy training with systematic self-reflection, it genuinely leads to a much greater sensitivity to the learning process. It gives students the actual skills to identify not just what they want to learn, but how they want to learn it. It completely empowered these students to bridge that terrifying gap between their spoon-fed high school days and the harsh demands of university. In practical terms, Noonan leaves us with this absolute gem. Language classrooms should have a dual focus, not only on teaching language content, but also on developing learning processes. As educators, or even as learners ourselves, we have to move past just delivering or consuming material. We have to actively build that internal engine, the ability to self-check, monitor, and truly evaluate our own growth. So, as we finish up this explainer, I really want to leave you with this final thought. Whether you're a teacher building a curriculum, a university student staring down a massive syllabus, or just a lifelong self-learner, you've got to ask yourself, how will you shift your focus from what you learn to how you learn? Thanks for exploring this study with me. Keep reflecting and keep learning.